was published by Copper Canyon Press in April 2020. Her other poetry books include Like a Beggar, The Human Line, and Mules of Love. Her poems appear frequently in the New Yorker, American Poetry Review, and many other journals. Among her awards are fellowships from the NEA, the California Arts Council, 3 Pushcart Prizes, the Lambda Literary Award, the Larry Levis Prize, and the New Letters Prize. She co-edited the first major anthology of women's poetry, No More Masks, and her nonfiction books include the groundbreaking The Courage to Heal, a guide for women survivors of child sexual abuse, and Free Your Mind, the book for gay, lesbian, and bisexual youth. A chancellor of the Academy of American Poets, Bass founded poetry workshops at Salinas Valley State Prison and the Santa Cruz, California jails, and teaches in the MFA writing program at Pacific University. The first time I heard Ellen Bass read was at the Women Write Resistance anthology reading with Margot Taft-Stever at AWP in Seattle. Despite the huge audience in an off-site restaurant where people were eating nachos and drinking beer, you could hear a pin drop when Ellen took the stage. It was an evening of solidarity and community. And when I first set out to invite Ellen to read on Zoom for the Hudson Valley Writer Center with Arthur Z, I had a flash of regret that this reading would not take place in person at our beautiful train station in Sleepy Hollow. But then I read this interview with Ellen in Bomb, where she discusses her book coming out at the beginning of the pandemic. She says, "My first thought was disappointment that my book tour was going to be wrecked, but it turns out that poetry is like a weed, and it's going to find its way through any crack. I have been busier than I've ever been with so many virtual events. People are hungry for poetry now. During hard times, people turn to poetry. Anytime there is a crisis or great sorrow, poetry helps us bear the unbearable. It helps us talk about things for which there aren't words without being reductive. One of the things," she says, "that poetry does is to bear witness to the world as it is. All art is holding this tension between elegy and ode, between our sorrows, despairs, and sufferings, and the praise, wonder, and awe that we feel. My little disappointment in my book tour has turned out to be an opportunity to reach more people. We are thrilled to have more people at this reading tonight than any other during the pandemic, and that is testament to the power and grace of these 2 stunning poets." As Wallace Ludell writes, "The poems in Indigo flow in ways that only basses can, stopping the world with their movements, both rapturous in their celebration and exultant in their heartbreak. There's a saying that happiness can only be found where there is denial of nothing, and Bass's poems look plainly at the world." Please help me give a warm welcome to Ellen Bass.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. I'm just delighted to be reading here with Arthur, whose work I admire so much. And also, maybe you don't all know this, but when I was a baby and co-editing No More Masks with Florence Howell, Margot Taft-Stever was also a baby, and she was included in that anthology. And I just looked at the dates before this reading just to see. I was going to say she was the youngest poet, but she's the second to the youngest poet among all the 20th century women poets up to 1973. And so I feel a special connection with the Writers Center in the Hudson Valley and the Slappering Hollow Press, just having been, we were both just starting out, and it's just great to be here with all of you. Thanks so much for coming. I wanted to just start by reading a couple of older poems, really just because I felt like it. And when I was looking at myself in the little square, these stripes, which I've never worn on Zoom, look like they would make everybody dizzy and crazy. When I look in the bigger one, it's okay, but should I make it so you can't like see it, like sort of like that, or it doesn't matter? It doesn't matter. Okay, well, on mine, it was doing this thing as though like it was very, very psychedelic, and maybe you would have to close your eyes to listen. So, but I didn't have time to go and put on another shirt because I was already here. So thank you for just letting me know that I'm not going to make you dizzy. This is an older poem, and I haven't read it for a long time, and I'm just glad to have a chance. It's called Gate C-22. At Gate C-22 in the Portland airport, a man in a broadband leather hat kissed a woman arriving from Orange County. They kissed and kissed and kissed. Long after the other passengers clicked the handles of their carry-ons and wheeled briskly toward short-term parking, the couple stood there, arms wrapped around each other, like he'd just staggered off the boat at Ellis Island, like she'd been released at last from ICU, snapped out of a coma, survived bone cancer, made it down from Annapurna in only the clothes she was wearing. Neither of them was young. His beard was gray. She carried a few extra pounds you could imagine her saying she had to lose. But they kissed lavish kisses, like the ocean in the early morning, the way it gathers and swells, sucking each rock under, swallowing it again and again. We were all watching, passengers waiting for the delayed flight to San Jose, the stewardesses, the pilots, the aproned woman icing Cinnabons, the man selling sunglasses. We couldn't look away. We could taste the kisses crushed in our mouths. But the best part was his face, when he drew back and looked at her, his smile soft with wonder, almost as though he were a mother, still open from giving birth, as your mother must have looked at you, no matter what happened after. Did she beat you or left you, or you're lonely now? You once lay there, the vernix not yet wiped off, and someone gazed at you, as if you were the first sunrise seen from the earth. The whole wing of the airport hushed, all of us trying to slip into that woman's middle-aged body, her plaid Bermuda shorts, sleeveless blouse, glasses, little gold hoop earrings, tilting our heads up. And this is one more earlier poem. It's called If You Knew. What if you knew you'd be the last to touch someone? If you were taking tickets, for example, at the theater, tearing them, giving back the ragged stub, you might take care to touch that palm, brush your fingertips along the lifeline's crease. When a man pulls his wheeled suitcase too slowly through the airport, when the car in front of me doesn't signal, when the clerk at the pharmacy won't say thank you, I don't remember they're going to die. A friend told me she'd been with her aunt. They'd just had lunch, and the waiter, a young gay man with plum black eyes, joked as he served the coffee, kissed her aunt's powdered cheek when they left. Then they walked half a block, and her aunt dropped dead on the sidewalk. How close does the dragon's spume have to come? How wide does the crack in heaven have to split? What would people look like if we could see them as they are, soaked in honey, stung and swollen, reckless, pinned against time? I wrote this next poem after getting very intrigued by words that are very hard or pretty much impossible to really find an equivalent for in another language in translating. And so that's how it began. It's called The Small Country. Unique, I think, is the Scottish tartle, that hesitation when introducing someone whose name you've forgotten. And what could capture cafuné, the Brazilian Portuguese way to say, running your fingers tenderly through someone's hair? Is there a term in any tongue for choosing to be happy? And where is speech for the block of ice we pack in the sawdust of our hearts? What appellation approaches the smell of apricots thickening the air when you boil jam in early summer? What words reach the way I touched you last night, as though I had never known a woman, an explorer, wholly curious to discover each particular fold and hollow, without guide, not even the mirror of my own body. Last night, you told me you liked my eyebrows. You said you never really noticed them before. What is the word that fuses this freshness with the pity of having missed it? And how even touch itself cannot mean the same to both of us, even in this small country of our bed, even in this language with only 2 native speakers. I wrote this next poem. It's an ode to my dear departed dog, Zeke, who was a great lover of poetry and poets. Got to know quite a lot of them. And I wrote this as he was in his last days, and it's called Ode to Zeke. O breathing drum, O cask of dark waters, O decaying star, my barking heart, my breaking brother, what will seep into the space your body leaves? O huge 18-muscled ears, oscillating ossicles and cochlea, your busy canals, now hollow caves of quiet. I have said your fur is black, but you are silvered, rhymed with frost. You are the new moon. You are light in the dark house. How long will I see your shadow? O heavy hunk of existence. O great flank I have rested my head upon when I was too weak for human touch. Sleek leading man, you debonair dog, how people on the avenue stopped to swoon. O splaying legs, once faster than rabbits, canines slashing flesh. Urgent thug, unstoppable thrust. O happy snapping at the wind. What do you remember now that you are mudslide, glacier melting, cliff collapsing into the sea? I have memorized your milky breath, your ballet leaps and whirligigging, your princely patience as the children dressed you. Soccer Zeke, in jersey and shorts, one paw on the ball. Snorkel Zeke, with mask and fins. Bar mitzvah Zeke, in a yarmulke and my father's silk talit. Oh, my text of decrepitude, my usher to death, companion of 10,000 years. I'll fry you a fish. I'll sit by your bowl. Eat from my hand. I have nowhere to go. And if you're very curious, I don't go on Instagram very much. I still haven't figured out how to do it. And I have a friend who helps me from time to time, but it's limited by when she feels like doing that. But there is a picture of Zeke in his yarmulke and my father's silk talit. If you ever need, if you ever just want to check him out, he is very beautiful. Okay. I was asked to write a poem for a project called New Voices, Contemporary Writers Confront Images of the Holocaust, that was being put together a few years back. And I'm always have a lot of trepidation when I'm asked to write something and I have to say I will, because most of the time I can't. And so I wind up writing something that isn't really a poem, but I said I would. But somehow these images and the way that this project was created, you were sent an image. You didn't have any choice over the image you were sent, and that helped me a lot because I didn't have to choose, which is one of the hardest things for me in anything. And so I looked at the image and felt grateful because right away I felt like I had an entrance there. And so I was able to write this poem. And the title of the poem is the title of the image. It's called Photograph, Jews Probably Arriving to the Woods Ghetto circa 1941 to 1942. Why is a horse here alongside the train? Two horses, yoked with leather harnesses, light silvering their flanks in the midst of the Jews descending. Where is the driver taking the cart, loaded with wooden planks? What is in the satchel that weighs down the arm of a woman in a dark coat, her hair parted on one side? A woman I could mistake for my mother in the family album, only my mother was in Philadelphia, selling milk and eggs and penny candy because her mother escaped the pogroms, a small girl in steerage crying for her mother. What are the tight knots of people saying to one another? A star burns the right shoulder blade of each man, each woman. Light strikes each shorn neck and caps each skull. No one is yet stripped of all but a pail or a tin to drink from and piss in. Dread, like sun, sears the air and breaks over the plains of their faces. Light clatters down upon them like stones, but we can't hear it. Nor can we hear blood thud under their ribs. They will be led into the ghetto and then will be led out to the camps. But for now, the eternal now, the light is silent, silent the shadows in the folds of their coats. The bones of the horses are almost visible. Their nostrils are deep, soft shadows. And the woman, who could be, but is not my mother, still carries her canvas bag and, looking closer, what might be a small purse. And I've written many odes. I love writing odes. It seems like when I'm really stuck, if I just put ode to at the top of the page, that there's a place to start. So it's odes have been a savior for me. Sometimes when I can't begin any other way. And I especially like writing odes to things that are not usually praised or even things that are despised. And in our culture, this one perhaps falls into that category. It's called Ode to Fat. Tonight, as you undress, I watch your wondrous flesh that swelled again, the way a river swells when the ice relents. Sweet relief, just to regard the sheaves of your hips, your boundless breasts, and marshy belly. I adore the acreage of your thighs and praise the promising planets of your ass. Oh, you were lean that terrifying year you were unraveling, as though you were returning to the slender scrap of a girl I fell in love with. But your skin was vacant, a ripped sack, sugar spilling out, and your bones insistent. Oh, praise the loyalty of the body that labors to rebuild its palatial realm. Bless butter, bless brie, sanctify schmaltz and cream and cashews. Stoke the furnace of the stomach and load the vessels. Darling, drench yourself in opulent oil, the lamp of your body glowing. May you always flourish, enormous and sumptuous, be marbled with fat, a great vault that I can enter, the cathedral where I pray. This is the title poem of my new now it feels like newish book. A new book doesn't feel new very long, in part because I take a long time between books. So by the time it's a new book, it's not even new to me. So, but it is the newest, and it's the title poem. It's called Indigo. As I'm walking on West Cliff Drive, a man runs toward me, pushing one of those jogging strollers with shock absorbers so the baby can keep sleeping, which this baby is. I can just get a glimpse of its almost translucent eyelids. The father is young, a jungle of indigo and carnelian, tattooed from knuckle to jaw, leafy vines and blossoms, saints and symbols. Thick wooden plugs pierce his lobes, and his sunglasses testify to the radiance haloed around him. I'm so jealous, as I often am. It's a kind of obsession. I want him to have been my child's father. I want to have married a man who wanted to be in a body, who wanted to live in it so much that he marked it up like a book, underlining, highlighting, writing in the margins, I was here. Not like my dead ex-husband who was always fighting against the flesh, who sat for hours on his zafu chanting Om, and then went out and broke his hand punching the car. I imagine when this galloping man gets home, he's going to want to have sex with his wife who slept in late, and then he'll eat barbecued ribs and let the baby teeth on a bone while he drinks a dark beer. I can't stop wishing my daughter had had a father like that. I can't stop wishing I'd had that life. Oh, I know, it's a miracle to have a life, any life at all. It took 8 years for my parents to conceive me. First there was the war, and then just waiting. And my mother's bones so narrow, she had to be slit and I airlifted. That anyone is born, each precarious success from sperm and egg to zygote, embryo, infant is a wonder. And here I am, alive, almost 70 years, and nothing has killed me. Not the car I totaled running a stop sign, or the spirochete that screwed into my blood. Not the tree that fell in the forest exactly where I was standing. My best friend shoving me backward so I fell on my ass as it crashed. I'm alive, and I gave birth to a child. So she didn't get a father who'd sling her onto his shoulder, and so much else she didn't get. I've cried most of my life over that. And now there's everything that we can't talk about. We love that cannot take too much of each other. Yet she is the one who, when I asked her to kill me, if I no longer had my mind, we were on our way into Ross shopping for dresses. That's something she likes, and they all look adorable on her. She's the only one who didn't hesitate or refuse or waver or flinch. As we strode across the parking lot, she said, okay, but when's the cutoff? That's what I need to know. And I'll end with this poem Any common desolation can be enough to make you look up at the yellowed leaves of the apple tree, the few that survived the rains and frost, shot with late afternoon sun. They glow a deep orange gold against a blue so sheer a single bird would rip it like silk. You may have to break your heart, but it isn't nothing to know even one moment fly. The sound of an oar in an oarlock, or a ruminant animal tearing grass, the smell of grated ginger, the ruby neon of the liquor store sign, warm socks. You remember your mother, her precision a ceremony, as she gathered the white cotton, slipped it over your toes, drew up the heel, turned the cuff. A breath can uncoil as you walk across your own muddy yard, the Big Dipper pouring night down over you, and everything you dread, all you can't bear, dissolves, and like a needle slipped into your vein, that sudden rush of the world.
Thank you so much, Ellen. That was an amazing reading, and you read your poems so beautifully too, on top of it all. You'll have the chat to read later. Sophia always sends them, so we'll make sure that you and Arthur both get the chat so you can see all of the notes that your fans have been writing to you during the reading. Arthur Z has published 11 books of poetry, including Sightlines, which won the National Book Award, and The Glass Constellation, New and Collected Poems, which came out this year in 2021. His other books include Compass Rose, a Pulitzer Prize finalist, The Ginkgo Light, selected for the Penn Southwest Book Award, and the Mountains and Plains Independent Booksellers Association Book Award, The Red Shifting Web, Poems 1970 to 1998, selected for the Balkaness Poetry Prize and the Asian American Literary Award, and Archipelago, selected for an American Book Award. He has also published a book of Chinese poetry translations, The Silk Dragon, selected for the Western States Book Award, and edited Chinese Writers on Writing in 2010. He is the recipient of many honors, including a Lannan Literary Award, a Guggenheim Fellowship, 2 National Endowment for the Arts Fellowships, a Howard Foundation Fellowship, and 5 grants from the Witterbiner Foundation for Poetry. His poems have been translated into a dozen languages. A Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, he is a Professor Emeritus at the Institute of American Indian Arts and was the first Poet Laureate of Santa Fe, New Mexico, where he lives with his wife, the poet Carol Moldow. Arthur Z is a poet who ponders the big questions. When one reads his collections, one always has the sense that he is there to serve not just the speaker, the poem, or the subject, but the whole aching and beautiful world. The poet Dana Levin describes him as a poet of deep noticing. His description, paired with his often jarring juxtapositions, offer the reader the ability to see the profound interconnectivity of disparate elements and ideas. As he said in an interview in Brooklyn Rail, quote, "We live on a planet where many worlds are woven together or are even in collision. Simultaneity is important for several reasons. First, it provides a structure that is nonlinear and allows for the coexistence of different worlds, where one world is not necessarily prioritized over another. Second, things can happen in close contact or across great distances, but they require close and even arduous attention to understand how the events may be relational. This requires imagination, insight, and understanding." There is no shortage of imagination, insight, and understanding in Z's brilliant body of work. It is not a surprise to learn that he has a background in physics. His evidence of scientific training is apparent throughout his work, and deepens the philosophical and theoretical scope of his poetry. For example, phrases from the powerful title poem of Sightlines are scattered throughout the book and stand alone to allow the reader to pause and take in the gravity and significance of these remarkable utterances, including "A woman detonates when a spam text triggers bombs trapped to her body," and "A man who built plutonium triggers breeds horses now." As dark as some of the images and events are in C's work, there is also an abundance of hope. Consider these lines from Circumference. "It is hard to believe farmers pollinate vanilla orchids with toothpick-sized needles. Yet we do as needed. Pouring syrup on a pancake, I catch the scent of vines, race along the circumference, sensing what it's like to sit in the dark with nothing in my hands." Please help me give a warm welcome to Arthur Z.
Thank you, Jennifer. I want to begin by thanking Jennifer Franklin, Sophia Bannister, and the founder, Margot Taft-Stever, and everyone connected with Hudson Valley Writers Center. It's such a pleasure to be here. And I want to say it's a particular and very special pleasure to be reading with Ellen Bass, whose work I've known for many years. And gee, just what a great delight and honor to be reading this evening. I'm going to be reading from my new and collected poems, The Glass Constellation. And rather than read in some kind of linear or chronological order, I've chosen poems that are thematically in conversation with each other. And I'm actually going to start with the very last poem, Transpirations. Leafing branches of a backyard plum, branches of water on a dissolving ice sheet, chatter of magpies when you approach, lilacs lean over the road weighted with purple blossoms. Then the noon sun shimmers the grasses. You ride the surge into summer. Smell of pinon crackling in the fireplace. Blued notes of a saxophone in the air. Not by sand running through an hourglass, but by our bodies igniting. Passing in the form of vapors from a living body. This world of orange sunlight and wildfire haze. World of iron filings pulled toward magnetic south and north. Pool of quicksilver when you bend to tie your shoes. Standing, you well up with glistening eyes. Have you lived with utmost care? Have you articulated emotions like the edges of leaves? Adjusting your breath to the seasonal rhythm of grasses, gazing into a lake on a salt flat and drinking in reflection the Milky Way. This next poem is in two sections and it's called The Unnamable River. Is it in the anthracite face of a coal miner, crystallized in the veins and lungs of a steel worker, pulverized in the grimy hands of a railroad engineer? Is it in a child naming a star, coconuts washing ashore, dormant in a volcano along the Rio Grande? You can travel the 4,000 miles of the Nile to its source and never find it. You can climb the 5 highest peaks of the Himalayas and never recognize it. You can gaze through the largest telescope and never see it. But it's in the capillaries of your lungs, It's in a corpse burning on the Ganges, in rain splashing on banana leaves. Perhaps you have to know you're about to die to hunger for it. Perhaps you have to go alone into the jungle armed with a spear to truly see it. Perhaps you have to have pneumonia to sense its crush. But it's also in the scissor hands of a clock. It's in the precessing motion of a top when a torque makes the axis of rotation describe a cone, and the cone spinning on a point gathers past, present, future. In a crude theory of perception, the apple you see is supposed to be a copy of the actual apple. But who can step out of his body to compare the two? Who can step out of his life and feel the Milky Way flow out of his hands? An unpicked apple dies on a branch. That is all we know of it. It turns black and hard, a corpse on the Ganges. Then go ahead and map out 3,000 miles of the Yangtze. Walk each inch, feel it surge and flow as you feel the surge and flow in your own body. And the spinning cone of a precessing top is a form of existence that gathers and spins death and life into one. It is in the duration of words, but beyond words. River, 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 river. The coal miner may not know he has it. The steel worker may not know he has it. The railroad engineer may not know he has it. But it is there. It is in the smell of an avocado blossom and in the true passion of a kiss. This next poem is in the voice of a piece of lichen speaking to a human being. It's called Lichen Song. Snow in the air. You've seen a crust on the ceiling wood and never considered how I gather moisture when you step out of the shower. You don't care that I respire as you breathe. For years, you've washed your face, gazed in the mirror, shaved, combed your hair, rushed out, while I, who may grow an inch in 1,000 years, catch the tingling sunlight. You don't understand how I can dive to a temperature of liquefied gas and warm back up again, absorb water, start growing again without a scar. I can float numb in space, be hit with cosmic rays, then return to earth and warm out of my sleep to respire again without a hiccup. You come and go while I stay gripped to pine, and the sugar of existence runs through you, runs through me. You sliver if you just go, go, go. If you slowed, you could discover that mosquitoes bat their wings 600 times a second, and before they mate, synchronize their wings, you could feel how they flicker with desire. I am flinging your words, and if you absorb, not blot my song, you could learn you're not alone in pain and grief, though you've instilled pain and grief. You can urge the dare and thrill of bliss if and when you stop to look at a rock at a fence post, you cough, only look, yes, look at me now because you are blink about to leave. This next poem is called First Snow. First snow. A rabbit has stopped on the gravel driveway. Imbibing the silence, you stare at spruce needles. There's no sound of a leaf blower, no sign of a black bear. A few weeks ago, a buck scraped his rack against an aspen trunk. A carpenter scribed a plank along a curved stone wall. You only spot the rabbit's ears and tail. When it moves, you locate it against speckled gravel. But when it stops, it blends in again. The world of being is like this gravel. You think you own a car, a house, this blue zigzagged shirt, but you just borrow these things. Yesterday, you constructed an aqueduct of dreams and stood at Gibraltar, but you possess nothing. Snow melts into a pool of clear water, and in this stillness, starlight behind daylight, wherever you gaze. So in contrast to a water poem, here's a fire poem. It's called Courtyard Fire. At autumn equinox, we make a fire in the courtyard. Sparks gust into the black air, and all seasons are enfolded in these flames. Snow gathers and tips the lilac twigs. A stinkhorn rises out of dirt below a water spout. Ants climb the peony stalks, and gazing into coals, I skydive and pass through stages of youth. At first, I climb a tower and looking out, find the world tipped. Then I dash through halls. If ripening is all, what can the dead teach us? We who must rage and lust, hurtle zigzagging between cars in traffic, affirm the call to abandon illusions is a call to abandon a condition that requires illusions. And as I pull the cord, spring rips and blooms. On landing, I sway on earth. This next poem is a sequence. It's the title poem to a book called The Ginkgo Light, and it has to do with what happened after the atom bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and what a ginkgo tree near a temple did. That's at the core, that's the sort of spark or impetus to this sequence. It's 7 sort of short, fairly short sections. The Ginkgo Light. A downy woodpecker drills into a utility pole. While you cut stems, arrange tulips in a vase, I catch a down bow on the A string, beginning of Song of the Wind. We savor black beans with cilantro and rice, Pinot Noir. As light slants through the kitchen window, spring is candlelight at our fingertips. Ice crunches in river breakup. Someone shovels snow in a driveway, collapses, and hospitalized, catches staph infection. Out of airplane wreckage, a woman identifies the ring on the charred corpse of her spouse. A travel writer whose wife is in hospice gazes at a lunar eclipse, the orange moon at 1/1,000,000th of its normal brightness. A 1,300-year-old lotus seed germinates. A ginkgo issues fan-shaped leaves. Each hour teems. A 7-year-old clips magenta lilacs for her mother. Electrocuted, tagging a substation. Patter of rain on a skylight. Manta rays feed along a lit underwater cove, seducing a patient he did not anticipate plummeting into an abyss. Over Siberia, a meteor explodes. I am happiest here, now. Lesser goldfinch with nesting fiber in its beak. Love has no near or far. Near Bikini Island, the atom bomb mushroomed into a fireball that obsidianed the azure sky. Splayed palm leaves, iridescent black in wind. That fireball moment always lurks behind the retired pilot's eyes, even when he jokes, pours vodka, displays his goggles, metal, leather jacket hanging from a peg. A woman hums as she works with willow, X-Acto knife, magnifying lens to restore a Hikaria Apache basket. She has no glimmer, a zigzag line is beginning to unravel. Does not know within a decade she will unload a slug into her mouth. Through a moon gate, budding lotuses in a pond. You're it. He stressed rational inquiry, then drove south into the woods, put a gun to his head, vaporized into shadows. Quince and peach trees leafing below the ditch, succession and simultaneity, the branch-like shapes in their sheets, pizzicati, up the river we will go. August 6th, 1945, a temple in Hiroshima, 1,130 meters from the hypocenter disintegrates, while its ginkgo buds after the blast. When the temple is rebuilt, they make exit entrance steps to the left and right around it. Sometimes one fingers annihilation before breaking into bliss. A mother with Alzheimer's knows her son, but not where she lives or when he visits. During the Cultural Revolution, Shumaw scrubbed 1 million dishes on a tanker and counted them in a trance. A dew point is when a musher jogs alongside her sled dogs, sparing them her weight on the ice to the finish. Loaves of bread on a rack. A car splashes a newspaper vendor on a traffic island. On the road of days, we spot zodiacal light above the horizon. Astronauts have strewn footprints and streptococci on the moon. Chance sparks the prepared mind. A Cooper's hawk perched on a cottonwood branch quickens or synapses. In the orchard, the sound of apricot blossoms unfolding. Mosquito larvae twitch water at the V-shaped berm that pools runoff to the pond. We do not believe we trudge around a flaming incense burner on a road of years. As fireflies brighten, we long to shimmer the darkness with streamers. A pickup veers toward, then away, skewing light across our faces. As light skews across our faces, We are momentarily blinded and directionless, have every which way to go. Lobelia flowers in a patio pot. A neighbor hands us 3 bib lettuces over a fence. A cricket stridulates outside the window. And while we listen to our exhale, inhale, ephemera become more enduring than concrete. Ginkgos flare out. A jagged crack spreads across windshield glass. We find to recoil from darkness is to feed the darkness. To suffer in time is dichotomous venation, to effloresce the time. One brisk morning, we snap to layers of overlapping fanned leaves scattered on the sidewalk. Finger, a scar on wrist, scar on abdomen. And this last poem is an experiment in repetition. Each line has a word that picks up a word or words from the previous line and includes the title, The White Orchard. Under a supermoon, you gaze into the orchard. A glass blower shapes a glowing orange mass into a horse. You step into a space where you once lived. Crushed mica glitters on plastered walls. A raccoon strolls in moonlight along the top of an adobe wall. Swimming in a pond, we notice a reflected cottonwood on the water. Clang, a deer leaps over the gate. Every 15 minutes, an elephant is shot for its tusks. You mark a bleached, earless lizard against the snowfall of this white page. The skins of eggplants glistening in a garden, or bodies glistening by firelight. Those skunks once ravaged corn or bright moments cannot be ravaged. Sleeping near a canal, you hear lapping waves. At dawn, waves lapping, and the noise of men unloading scallops and shrimp. No noise of gunshots. You focus on the branches of 100-year-old apple trees. Opening the door, we find red and yellow rose petals scattered on our bed. Then light years. You see pear branches farther in the orchard as the moon rises. Branches bending under the snow of this white page. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur. What a wonderful reading from both of you. Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Arthur. It was one of our best readings that we've ever had. We're really happy to have both of you here. And Sophia has pinned you both to the screen so you can be side by side for your Q&A. Thank you, Sophia. We have a lot of questions in the chat, but one question that we always like to start the evening with on behalf of our students at the Hudson Valley Writers Center is for you to each talk a little bit about putting together a first poetry collection and any advice that you have. I know it was a while ago now for both of you, but any advice that you have for emerging writers.
Should I begin? Do you want to begin, Arthur?
Go ahead, please start.
Well, I think that the first thing that I talk to my students about is that if you're very serious about writing poetry and you hope to do this for a long time, and then don't be in a hurry, because you can only publish your first book once. And I didn't know this kind of thing way back, but I think it's important, and it's a kind of coming out. And if I'm working with somebody who is my age and they just want to get a book out into the world, you know, and make sure they do it before they die, then I said, well, go ahead and just do whatever you want. But if you think that you know, you're going to be at this for some time, I think that's my most important advice, is to take your time, and also get some really good help in sorting out your best poems from your poems that aren't been important to you and maybe to others.
Whoops, I think, Ellen, at least on my screen, you're freezing a little bit with your internet. I'm not sure if everyone else can hear that. But while Ellen is working on unfreezing, maybe Arthur could jump
Sure.
in and tell us his answer to that.
So I totally second Ellen saying, slow things down, don't be in such a hurry, don't rush it. I would add a few things, and I'll share just a little bit of the process that I use. I think it's important when you're putting any book together, and certainly a first book, to ask yourself, what is the inner necessity of each of these poems? Are they good enough? Have they earned their place into the book? And sometimes you'll find and realize that some poems maybe aren't quite done yet, or are worth reworking, or aren't good enough to put in. And those are all important signals, and part of the process that one needs to trust. I like to sometimes lay out blank pages between poems when I'm laying out a book. I like to work on the floor. So I'll ask myself, what is the opening poem? What is the closing poem? What if a different poem is the opening? How does that change the kind of shape and unfolding of the book? I want to feel that there's some kind of rigor and inner necessity at work. And I also like to think sometimes when I'm using blank pages, to think, well, maybe there are two poems that don't quite go together, but maybe there's a poem that could be written that isn't necessarily a linear bridge, but there's a page that needs to be written that serves the overall arc or unfolding of the book as a whole. So again, I think it's important to not rush it, to play around with the beginning and the ending, to think about the rhythm, the structure. Is this a book in no sections, in one section, two sections, three? Why? And again, the important thing is to, again, then look at each poem and think, has it earned its place there?
Well, I'm sorry that my internet got weird, but I don't know if this got said while I was gone, but the other thing, just a kind of tip, would be when you send out your manuscript to publishers, it doesn't have to be in the order that it will be ultimately. So, you know, if your trajectory starts with some poems, I mean, I don't think you should have weak poems, but if you don't think it starts with your very best poem, but you think that's what the trajectory of the book should be, when you send it to publishers, you might not want to use that order. You might want to start with the poems that you think are your absolute strongest, because sometimes they're reading very quickly and you want to grab them, and they can always say to you, I love this book, but I think the order is bad. And then you just reorder. You can tell I'm a very practical person.
That's very good advice. And it's interesting advice because we often hear put your best poems at the beginning, but we don't often hear the rationale that, you could always go back and say, here's the order that I really wanted to do. So that's very helpful. And, a lot of people in the audience are poets who have published first books, and they're saying in the chat, this is good advice even for second books. Each book has its own challenge. So I don't know if there's anything else you want to say on selecting and putting books together. But Sophia will have a question from the chat to ask you in a moment if you don't have anything to add on this topic.
I guess the only other thing I'd say is that I came in and heard some of Arthur's advice, which I think is, of course, excellent. And but you also might be a person like me whose books are mainly held together just by, that's sort of what I wrote in the last 7 or 8 or 9 years. And so I'm going to get this quote wrong, but Picasso said something like that he pities artists who don't want to put blondes in the same picture as a bowl of fruit because they don't go, and that he just puts everything in his picture, and then the things have to find their own way to get along with each other. And that's kind of like my poems. I think that you could see some, in some books more than others, you can see some threads, you can see some cohesions, but it's sort of like, this is the best of what I've got. And I just want to say, if you're in that, it can sound like everybody else is doing it in such a more rational and organic and brilliant way. So I just kind of want to give a little encouragement to those of you whose the way their book is put together is maybe not quite, maybe you have to sort of, in a way, cook up a rationale afterward.
Thank you so much for those answers. We have someone in the chat wanting to go back to a phrase Arthur used in his answer. Arthur, you said to look at the inner necessity of each poem. So someone's now asking if you can elaborate on what that means.
Yeah, I guess it's wonderful to be sharing this conversation with Ellen, because we take very different paths, but I think we get to a place that is actually quite compatible with each other. I oftentimes like to think about what the structure to a book is, and what happens if this is the opening poem and that's the closing poem. And I want to have a sense of discovery. I want to favor an element of spontaneity and surprise. I don't want to feel like the order of the book is too thought out or too, overly thought out. And so when I say the inner necessity of the book, for instance, the Ginkgo Light, the title poem that I read, there's a whole bunch of, if you look through the book, there's a history of ginkgo leaves as a living fossil. There's the idea of the biology of a ginkgo leaf that's dichotomous venation, which that phrase appears near the end of the sequence, which is that each biologically in a ginkgo leaf, from the vein that's at the tip, each vein splits into 2 and into 2 and into 2, and that creates the fan-shaped pattern of the ginkgo leaf. But it's also a metaphor for me about how one can't go back in time. There are these constant choices that one makes in life, and one is continually forced to choose and sort of move along that path. And there's the ginkgo tree that blossoms after the bomb, the Hiroshima bomb. So there's a kind of pervading sense of this biological, this ecological motion through the book. And I think when I put that book together, there may have been 1 or 2 poems that I just felt were so stylistically different. I didn't feel like, oh, I'm not going to ever publish these, but I felt like they didn't belong in the vision of that book, that I was going to save them for the next book. I don't know if Ellen, if you've ever done that, but oftentimes I'll have the sense of a kind of thread that I'm discovering. And once in a while, there might be one poem I'll just put to the side because it doesn't quite fit in.
Yes.
Thank you, Arthur, for elaborating on that. Indran has another question for you, and then Sophia will ask a question for Ellen. Indran asks, can you speak about your poetry responding not only to American poetic traditions, but also those of Japan and China, of imagist poetry brushed on paper? Do you feel that you inherit these traditions and yet make the poem new? Would you characterize what's new, maybe in your poetry from those traditions?
I'll jump in and just say that I never went to graduate school, and I learned my craft at UC Berkeley translating Tang Dynasty poetry. And I went through character by character, stroke by stroke, each of the ancient poems that I was going to translate as a way of trying to think inside of the poem, thinking about how did this poet, say Dufu, create this character and then the next, and why did he choose this character, not say another? So I learned my craft really through, I would say, conversation with ancient Chinese poems. And I felt like because I was writing in English, and over 1,000 years later, that the world is so different and my language is so different, even though I'm Chinese American. So I felt like I could draw on this tradition, but I didn't feel like I was dominated or trapped by that tradition because I was writing in a different language. English has such a different sense of time and syntax and precision that classical Chinese doesn't. But I feel like I learned from ancient Chinese poetry the way that Chinese poems foreground the image, the way the image can even become a vehicle for emotion, in the way, say, sunlight is shining on a piece of moss becomes like this moment of revelation and intense excitement. I felt like, and I feel like over time, I'm in conversation with many different Chinese poets, and certainly Japanese haiku poets have also been important to me, but I don't know any Japanese. So again, I'm an outsider to that tradition, whereas the Chinese I can read character by character and translate. So I draw on those two traditions, but I don't feel like I'm bound by them. I feel like I'm learning from them and also transforming them.
Thank you so much for that answer. We have a request for Ellen from someone in the chat who is requesting and asking if it would be possible for you to read The Thing Is for her and her mother.
Sure. I can get it in just a half a second.
Take your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. That's wonderful.
I'm happy to share it. Here we go. The thing is to love life, to love it even when you have no stomach for it, and everything you've held dear crumbles like burnt paper in your hands, your throat filled with the silt of it. When grief sits with you, its tropical heat thickening the air, heavy as water, more fit for gills than lungs. When grief waits you like your own flesh, only more of it, an obesity of grief. You think, how can a body withstand this? Then you hold life like a face between your palms, a plain face, no charming smile, no violet eyes, and you say, yes, I will take you. I will love you again.
Mm.
Thank you, Ellen. That was beautiful. maybe each of you could talk a little bit about craft. And you've touched on it a little bit already in your answers, but maybe if you could tell us a little bit more about your process and how you approach revision.
Yes. Could we just all hang out for the next month or so? Maybe I would like to mention, maybe I'll just start out by mentioning this. I love talking about craft. It's hard to talk about it quickly for me.
Yes.
But
Well, we'd love to have you back to teach for us.
I love talking about it. And one of the things that the pandemic made possible was for me to teach online. And one of the things teaching online made possible was to be able to have pretty much unlimited scholarships. So which is something that I'd never been able to do before, because I do teach at Pacific University in the low res MFA, but that isn't enough to live on, and I never have taught in a regular university where you know have a reliable salary. So I've always been kind of freelance teaching, and you have to make a certain amount of money. And so I've been doing these craft talks, and I've just finished the third series. In the fall will be the fourth series, and there's a series on revision. And the fourth series information isn't going to be up for a few more days, and then it will be. But it's been fabulous. To be able to offer this, just, I mean, the price is reasonable, and many people, it's not a hardship at all. But if it is, please come, pay the price, or pay what you can, or pay nothing, and tell other people. And the revision series, if I do say so myself, is crazy good, because we've got unpublished drafts from many, many contemporary poets, some of whom come on and talk about them, and we're able to look through them in detail. And really, I was very excited by this, because I've only ever taught revision with students where I'm looking at their work and helping them with their revisions. And in a workshop, of course, they can then also see the process with their peers in the workshop. But I have never taught it without being able to work with I've never taught it where I couldn't work with the participants' own poems. So that was very exciting to me, especially during the pandemic, to have something to think about that I'd never thought about before. And when I prepared for it for months, and by the time I started to give the talks, my wife was so glad, because it's all I talked about for like 4 months as I was preparing this. She said, I'm so glad you're getting started, because it has been interesting, but I don't think I can stand it any longer. But go to my website. It's just ellenbass.com, and you can join the my email list if you want to, or you can just sign up for the workshop. But anyway, my revision process, personally, I'll just say a word, is very eclectic, because my writing process is whatever I can do. And so there are poets who have a more reliable way that they enter their poems, work through their poems, and achieve their finished poems. And if I could be one of those poets, I would sign up in a second, but I'm not. And so I sometimes start with just pages of journal writing, and then I have to just, find anything in there. Sometimes I wrote a poem this past summer where I actually was inspired by and used as a something to start with an imitation of Arthur's poem Here. And it's a poem that uses anaphora, and the first word of every line is here. And when I had written a bunch in my journal and I couldn't get anywhere, and I grabbed his poem because I had been teaching that poem, and I thought, okay, I'm just going to do everything Arthur does. And so I did all that. But of course, that wasn't going to work because it was going to sound like, Arthur's poem, only not so good. And so I tried then substituting now for here. And I thought, okay, but actually that didn't work because I was in my particular poem, it didn't work. It was during the fires, the fires in California. And it really was about place, not about time. So substituting now didn't work. And so I wound up going through a whole bunch of processes, but eventually I took out all but 2 heres. And so it is not a poem that uses anaphora, but the poem actually, if you know Arthur's work, you would, and you do now, and there's a way in which I still stole very smartly, I thought. Stealing is great. Steal all you can. Arthur is very, very inimical to him style, which isn't my usual style, of very separate stanzas that kind of work together. But I hope it's not so similar that someone will say, well, this is like Arthur's Z, only not as good. But that's how we learn. I mean, part of how we learn is through, and I am still learning. I think we're always still learning, is by imitation. So, but every poem for me has a different revision process.
I'll pick up on Ellen's comment and agree that every poem has its own revision process. And I'm going to complicate things a little bit and say that early on, I could, when I was first writing poems, I could distinguish drafts of poems, like here's the first draft, and then I would revise it, and here's the second. And I tended to sort of expand and cut back down. And I discovered after I cut back down, I had a very difficult time trying to re-expand a poem if I continue to revise it. But I think over time, my writing process has really slowed down, where in a way those distinctions between drafts dissolve into the kind of morass of writing. So I tend to make a mess of things and realize, instinctively, for instance, if I know where the poem is going too soon, that I'm in too much control and there isn't enough discovery and surprise. And so I need to slow that impulse down and kind of make a mess. And sometimes when I'm revising, I'll think, oh, well, this phrase, maybe it's a little better, but it's easily intelligible. And then something I don't quite understand sort of enters. And I think I kind of like that. I sort of trust the sound and the rhythm, that sometimes I'm writing toward something I don't yet understand, that I can intellectually, in terms of my intelligence, articulate what it is, but in my body, I'm feeling like there's some kind of resonance or power. And then I want to be able to give myself time to explore that. And that again slows the whole writing process down. And so I end up with these kinds of messes. And then eventually things start to sort of like peel away, if that makes any sense.
I think we have another question in the chat. Sophia, did you have anything that you up next in your queue, or should I ask one?
I don't have anything else in the queue, so you can ask one.
Okay. We had a question about imagery. in your poems, if you could each talk a little bit about imagery and how important overtly or consciously it is to you.
Do you want to start, Arthur?
Okay. I think I've already touched on it when I said that I have translated classical Chinese poetry, and that's a tradition really important to me, because so much of classical Chinese poetry presents through an image. And I'm not sure where to elaborate. I mean, Wallace Stevens says, I believe in the image. I'm jumping to the West to Adachi. But if you look at classical Chinese poetry, if you look at classical Japanese haiku, there's a huge emphasis and belief in allowing the image to carry a lot of the experience of poetry. So I'm just thinking of a Li Bai poem, Jade Stairs Grow White Dew. It's a famous poem that is Rapound translated as the Jeweled Stairs Grievance. But there's an image of jade stairs, and then it being so cool at night that beads of dew form on that. I mean, that's a prime example of, say, using the image, of prioritizing the image, believing in it to become a vehicle for something much larger. And it turns out it's an image of a woman at court waiting for her lover who never shows. And there's that sense of desire, of being abandoned, of loneliness, of isolation. But none of that is ever directly in the poem. The image is carrying so much of the weight. So, you know, just in the brief answer, that's an example of how one can harness or use an image. And certainly when I use the image of the Milky Way, I'm trying to create the sense of how very small we are in the vast scheme of things without saying something directly, but just, again, using the image to convey that immensity.
Yes, that's beautiful. The image, to me, is really the heart of poetry. And that's what makes people feel things. And that's what we want to do. We want the reader, we want to have an experience when we write the poem. And we want the reader to have an experience when they read the poem. We don't want them to just find out what we think. And so the image is what does that. That's what carries the emotion, the sentiment of the poem. The image does the heavy lifting. And sometimes those images just come to us, and sometimes we have to work for them to find the image that's going to create those feelings in the reader. I think the image too, the image is when you make an image, whether it's a literal image like a detail, or whether it's a figurative image like a metaphor, either one, you're trusting the reader to have their own response. You're not shoving your idea down the throat of the reader. You're controlling the reader to some extent, because you make the image and you present it, and you do that, you know, thoughtfully, so that you know, if it doesn't create the feeling in the reader, then it's not going to work. So you are in charge of it to a certain extent, but you're not really in charge of how the reader is going to experience it. And different readers are going to bring different life experience. And so they're going to feel, you know, within certain parameters, they're going to feel differently, and it's going to mean different things to them. So I think there's a lot of trust and respect in the image when you share that with the reader. You're willing to let them have their own reaction, which is something that we all I think, appreciate so much in life, whether it's in poetry or whether we're just interacting with another person. But the image is kind of all in a certain kind of way. I mean, we have to, of course, have ideas, and we have to have a structure that works. The structure is incredibly important. But and I guess I feel that way in part because that's image and metaphor especially, is what I feel like is my most natural suit. And I think that's one good thing to think about, all of you who are writers, is what are your strengths and what are your weaknesses? And so that your strengths will never leave you, they will always be there. And the weaknesses, so like, I think metaphor is one of my strengths. I don't think music is my strength. So I have to really work consciously to create the music. And the metaphors more often are just willing. But I think part of, as we become more experienced, we get to know our own strengths and weaknesses, and then we can build on that.
I would second the building. There are the natural strengths and weaknesses, and then it's years and years of effort of building. And sometimes I will lay out, a set of poems I've written over the last few months, and I'll lay them out on the floor and say, okay, what are the strengths? What are the weaknesses? What are the obsessions? What isn't in the poem? What is in the poem? And sometimes I really have to work very hard at what I think are maybe the weaknesses, and to be able to turn them into signature strengths. The work is endless. And I feel like it's something that keeps me going. I feel like I'm always learning and growing from that.
I love that you say that, Arthur. It is endless. It's a really good occupation for somebody who doesn't want to ever run out of what you can do, right, and what you can learn, and where you'll never be satisfied. I'm speaking for, I think, 99% of poets. Now and then I talk to a poet, or I read an interview with a poet who seems to say that they're satisfied with the way they write and what they're writing. But most of the rest of us, we're always, it's like the horizon. The further you go, the further it goes. And for me, it doesn't get easier. And I think it does for some people, but it doesn't for me. So it's great for people who like to work hard.
That's true. Well, thank you all so much for being here. And thank you to Arthur and Ellen for your generosity and your beautiful poems, and for making us feel like we were actually with you together in a room. It's a rare feat to pull that off, and you did that for us tonight. So we really appreciate it. Thank you for letting us record this reading so all of our students can listen to it who weren't able to be here tonight. We really